It was a freezing winter night, and young Jake, no older than 8, stood shivering in the dimly lit driveway of his foster home. Snowflakes swirled around him, sticking to his bare feet and thin pajama shirt. The bitter cold bit at his skin, but he didn't dare move. Behind him, the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang. From the other side, his foster mother's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "Maybe a little time out there will teach you some respect." Jake didn't cry. He had learned long ago that tears only made things worse. He stood silently, his small shoulders trembling, his breath coming out in visible puffs. The world around him was eerily quiet, save for the occasional whistle of the wind. The distant lights of other homes glowed warmly, a stark contrast to the icy emptiness of his current reality. Jake's life hadn't always been this way. Just a year ago, he was living with his parents in a cozy house filled with laughter and love. His mother would hum as she made breakfast, and his father would ruffle his hair before heading off to work. But everything changed in an instant. A car accident claimed both his parents, leaving Jake orphaned and thrust into a foster care system that promised safety but delivered anything but. At first, Mrs. Linton, his foster mother, seemed like a blessing. She greeted him with a warm smile. Her house was impeccably clean, and she assured the social workers that Jake would be well cared for. But the moment the door closed behind them, her demeanor shifted. Her smile faded, replaced by a stern, disapproving glare. "I don't tolerate nonsense," she had said. "You'll follow my rules, or you'll regret it." The punishments started small, missing a meal for spilling milk or being sent to his room for speaking out of turn. But they quickly escalated. Mrs. Linton found reasons to punish Jake for nearly everything. If he forgot to do a chore, she'd make him scrub the kitchen floor until his knees were raw. If he spoke too loudly, she'd lock him in the closet for hours. And when he accidentally broke a plate while drying the dishes, she slapped him so hard he saw stars. Despite her cruelty, Mrs. Linton maintained a perfect image in public. She was a regular churchgoer, often volunteering for charity events and bringing baked goods to her neighbors. Such a kind woman, they would say. No one would have guessed the monster lurking beneath the surface. Jake felt utterly alone. He tried to tell his teacher about Mrs. Linton once, but she waved him off. "Mrs. Linton is a pillar of the community," she said. "I'm sure she's just strict because she wants the best for you." Jake quickly realized that no one would believe him, so he stopped trying. But even in the darkest moments, Jake found small glimmers of hope. He discovered a neighbor's golden retriever, Max, who often wandered into Mrs. Linton's yard. Max had a way of sensing when Jake was sad, nudging him with his nose or resting his head on Jake's lap. Those brief moments of connection with Max were the only times Jake felt truly safe. One day, while locked in the closet after forgetting to fold the laundry, Jake made a silent vow. "I'll survive this," he whispered to himself in the darkness. "I'll get out of here, and I'll never let anyone treat me like this again." The turning point came unexpectedly. It was a cold January morning, and Jake was exhausted from a sleepless night spent cleaning the house after Mrs. Linton spilled wine on the carpet and blamed him. At school, he could barely keep his eyes open. His teacher, Ms. Harper, noticed his pale complexion and the dark circles under his eyes. During recess, she pulled him aside. "Jake," she said softly, kneeling to his level, "is everything okay at home?" Jake hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the pain and fear he carried every day. But Mrs. Linton's words echoed in his mind. "If you tell anyone about this, they'll send you to a worse place. No one will believe you anyway." "I'm fine," he mumbled, avoiding Miss Harper's gaze. But Miss Harper wasn't convinced. She had seen the bruises on Jake's arms and the way he flinched when someone raised their voice. Determined to help, she decided to keep a closer eye on him. That evening, Jake's world shattered further. Mrs. Linton was in a particularly foul mood, yelling at him for not cleaning the windows properly. She grabbed his arm, yanking him so hard that he fell to the ground. Useless, Jake lay on the cold tile floor, tears stinging his eyes. He thought about his parents, wondering if they could see him from wherever they were. "I miss you," he whispered to himself. "I wish you were here." The next morning, Jake woke up to find Mrs. Linton's wrath still simmering. She shoved a plate of cold toast in front of him and barked, "Eat it, and get out of my sight." Jake complied, silently enduring her venom. As he walked to school, he passed by Max's house. The golden retriever bounded over, wagging his tail enthusiastically. Jake knelt down, burying his face in Max's fur. "I wish I could stay with you," he whispered. "You're the only one who's nice to me." Unbeknownst to Jake, Max's owner, Mr. Carter, was watching from his window. He had noticed Jake's quiet demeanor and the way he clung to Max as if the dog were his lifeline. Something about the boy tugged at his heart. That evening, as Jake sat alone in his room, he heard a knock at the door. Mrs. Linton opened it, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Oh, Mr. Carter, what a surprise. What brings you here?" "I just wanted to check on the boy," Mr. Carter said. "I've noticed he seems a bit withdrawn." Mrs. Linton's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. "Oh, Jake's fine. He's just shy. You know how kids are." Mr. Carter wasn't convinced. "Mind if I speak to him?" Mrs. Linton hesitated, but eventually called Jake downstairs. Jake's heart raced as he descended the steps, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Carter knelt down, looking him in the eye. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently. "How are you doing?" Jake glanced at Mrs. Linton, who stood behind Mr. Carter with a warning glare. "I'm fine," he muttered. But Mr. Carter could see the fear in Jake's eyes. "If you ever need someone to talk to," he said, slipping a small card into Jake's hand, "I'm here." That night, Jake stared at the card, his mind racing. Could he trust Mr. Carter? Was it worth the risk? The answer came a week later, on a frigid evening when Mrs. Linton's punishments reached a breaking point. She locked Jake outside again, leaving him to shiver in the snow while she sat inside, sipping tea. Desperate and freezing, Jake remembered the card in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number. "Hello." Mr. Carter's voice came through the line. "It's Jake," he whispered. "I need help." Within minutes, Mr. Carter arrived with a blanket and called the authorities. Mrs. Linton protested vehemently, accusing Jake of lying, but the evidence was undeniable. Social workers found bruises, scars, and even a hidden journal where Jake had documented his abuse. Mrs. Linton was arrested, her carefully curated image destroyed. Jake was placed with a new foster family, a kind couple who treated him with love and respect. For the first time in months, Jake felt safe. Over time, Jake began to heal. He started therapy, joined a soccer team, and even made friends at school. His bond with Max grew stronger, with Mr. Carter often bringing the dog over for visits. Years later, Jake stood on a stage at a community event, sharing his story. "I thought kindness didn't exist," he said, his voice steady. "But one act of compassion changed my life. If you see someone in need, don't look away. You could be the reason their story turns around." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. Mr. Carter and Max watched proudly from the front row, their presence a reminder of the power of empathy. Jake's journey wasn't easy, but it was a testament to resilience, hope, and the transformative impact of kindness. And as he looked out at the crowd, he knew his story had the power to inspire others to make a difference. Jake's journey toward healing was far from over. Though he was now in a loving foster home with the Reynolds family, the scars, both visible and hidden, remained. The Reynolds were kind and patient, giving Jake the time and space he needed to adjust. But Jake often found himself retreating into silence, struggling to trust that this new life wasn't just a fleeting dream that could vanish at any moment. His new foster parents, Laura and Peter Reynolds, were a warm and understanding couple in their late 40s. Laura was a school librarian with an uncanny ability to make anyone feel safe, and Peter was a handyman whose quiet strength reminded Jake of his late father. Their home was cozy, with shelves overflowing with books and framed photographs of their 3 grown children, who had all moved out years earlier. Despite their efforts, Jake couldn't shake the fear that their kindness came with strings attached, just like Mrs. Linton's fake smiles. He struggled to express himself, often retreating to his room to sketch in a notebook Laura had bought him. Drawing became his refuge, a silent way to process the storm of emotions he couldn't put into words. One day, Laura gently knocked on his bedroom door. "Jake, honey, I made some cookies. Want to come down and have some?" Jake hesitated before nodding. He followed her to the kitchen, where the smell of chocolate chip cookies filled the air. Peter was sitting at the table, repairing a birdhouse with a gentle focus. Laura set a plate of cookies in front of Jake and sat beside him. "I was thinking," she began, "how about we plant a little garden in the backyard? You could decide what we grow. Flowers, vegetables, whatever you like." Jake stared at the cookie in his hand, unsure how to respond. The idea of creating something that could grow and thrive, sparked a faint flicker of interest. He shrugged, murmuring, "Maybe." Laura smiled softly. "No rush. Just let me know if you decide. We're here for you, Jake. Always." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Jake wasn't used to. They didn't demand anything from him. They didn't come with conditions. It was the first time he felt a tiny crack in the wall he built around his heart. As weeks turned into months, Jake began to settle into his new life. He started school again, and though he was quiet and reserved, he found solace in the art class offered twice a week. His teacher, Mrs. Hartley, was a vibrant woman with paint-streaked hands and an infectious passion for creativity. She noticed Jake's talent immediately. One afternoon, as Jake worked on a drawing of Max, the golden retriever who had been his silent protector, Mrs. Hartley leaned over his shoulder. "That's incredible, Jake. You've got a real gift." Jake shrugged, unsure how to take the compliment. Mrs. Hartley didn't push. Instead, she suggested that Jake submit his work to the school's upcoming art show. "No pressure," she added, "but I think people would love to see what you create." Jake considered it, but the idea of putting himself, and his art, on display made him anxious. What if people didn't like it? What if they laughed? The echoes of Mrs. Linton's harsh words still lingered, convincing him he wasn't good enough. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter, the neighbor who had saved Jake, remained a steady presence in his life. He would often bring Max over for visits, and the dog's joyful energy was a balm for Jake's lingering pain. Mr. Carter also encouraged Jake to talk about his feelings, but he never pushed. "Whenever you're ready," he would say, "I'm here." One afternoon, as they walked Max in the park, Mr. Carter stopped and turned to Jake. "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to share your story with others. It could help someone who's going through the same thing." Jake frowned, kicking at a stone on the path. "Why would anyone care?" "Because your story matters," Mr. Carter said firmly. "What you went through, how you're finding your way. It's powerful, Jake. You could make a difference." The idea planted itself in Jake's mind, but he wasn't sure he was ready. Sharing his story felt like opening a wound that hadn't fully healed. Yet, as he looked at Max wagging his tail and Mr. Carter's steady gaze, Jake felt the faint stirrings of courage. The turning point came during the school's art show. After much encouragement from Laura, Peter, and Mrs. Hartley, Jake finally agreed to submit one of his drawings. He chose the sketch of Max, a piece that held both his pain and his hope. The night of the show, Jake stood nervously by his display, his heart pounding as people stopped to admire his work. He overheard snippets of conversations. "Look at the detail in the eyes. This one tells a story." For the first time, Jake felt seen, not as a victim, but as an artist. Toward the end of the evening, The principal approached Jake with a warm smile. "We'd like to feature your piece in the local community center," she said. "It's truly exceptional." Jake was stunned. "Really? Really?" That night, as Jake lay in bed, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. The dark days with Mrs. Linton, the kindness of Mr. Carter and Max, the unwavering support of the Reynolds. Each piece of his story had led him to this moment. For the first time, in a long time, he felt a spark of hope for the future. With time, Jake began to share more of his story. It started with a small group at the community center, where he spoke about his experiences in foster care and the importance of kindness. At first, his voice shook, and his words came out haltingly. But as he looked at the faces in the audience, some tearful, some nodding in understanding, he found his confidence growing. His story resonated deeply, inspiring others to step up for children in need. Local businesses donated to foster care programs, neighbors volunteered as mentors, and teachers paid closer attention to the quiet, withdrawn kids in their classrooms. Jake's courage created ripples, touching lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. Years later, Jake stood on a larger stage, speaking to a packed auditorium. He was no longer the timid boy afraid of his own voice. He was a young man who had turned his pain into purpose, using his story to advocate for change. "I used to think kindness didn't exist," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But one act of compassion, one man and his dog, saved me. And now I want to pay it forward. If you see someone in need, don't look away. You have the power to change their story." As the audience erupted into applause, Jake spotted Mr. Carter and Max in the front row. Tears filled his eyes as he smiled, knowing that their kindness had been the turning point in his life. Jake's journey wasn't just a story of survival. It was a testament to the power of resilience, hope, and the extraordinary impact of small acts of compassion. And as he walked off the stage, he knew his story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a life dedicated to making the world a kinder place. Jake's transformation into a confident young man, an artist, and an advocate for foster care reform was inspiring. But his journey wasn't without challenges. Even as his voice grew louder and his influence expanded, he often found himself grappling with the echoes of his past. Nightmares of Mrs. Linton's cruel words and actions still haunted him, and the weight of his story often left him feeling drained. But Jake was determined to push forward, not just for himself, but for others who were still trapped in the shadows. One of Jake's first major projects after his rise as an advocate was a community art initiative. Partnering with the local community center and a few other artists, Jake proposed creating a mural that represented resilience and hope. The mural would be painted on the side of a building near the town's main park, a place Jake had often visited with Max during his early days of healing. He wanted it to be a reminder to everyone passing by that even in the darkest times, there was a way forward. The town was hesitant at first. Some residents thought the mural would be too bold or out of place, while others questioned why Jake, a young man who had only recently found his voice, was taking on such an ambitious project. But Jake didn't back down. He spoke at town meetings, sharing his vision and explaining why the mural was important. "This isn't just about me," he said during one particularly heated discussion. "It's about every child who feels invisible, every person who's been told they don't matter. This mural is a symbol, a reminder that we all have value, no matter what we've been through." His passion was contagious. Slowly, people began to rally behind the project. Donations poured in, local businesses offered supplies, and volunteers of all ages showed up to help. Jake designed the mural himself, incorporating elements of his story, while leaving room for others to add their own touches. The centerpiece was a large, vibrant tree with deep roots and branches that stretched toward the sky. Around the tree, smaller images told stories of resilience: a pair of hands lifting a child, a broken chain, a sunrise. As the mural took shape, Jake found himself connecting with people from all walks of life. A retired teacher shared her memories of helping foster children find their footing. A teenage girl confided that her best friend was in the system and often felt hopeless. Even the mayor stopped by, commending Jake for his initiative. One day, while Jake was working on the mural, he noticed a boy about 10 years old standing off to the side, watching intently. The boy's clothes were worn, and his posture was defensive, as if he were ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. "Hey," Jake called gently, setting down his paintbrush. "Want to help?" The boy hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for a trap. "I don't know how to paint," he mumbled. "That's okay," Jake said with a reassuring smile. "Neither did I when I started. I can show you." After a long pause, the boy shuffled forward. Jake handed him a small brush and guided him to an open section of the wall. "This part here," Jake said, pointing to a patch of sky, "needs a little more color. Think you can handle it?" The boy nodded, and as he started to paint, Jake asked, "What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy replied softly. "Well, Marcus, you're doing a great job," Jake said. "You've got a good eye for this." As the days passed, Marcus became a regular at the mural site. He didn't say much, but his confidence grew with each stroke of the brush. Jake learned that Marcus was living in a group home, struggling to find his place in the world. The boy's story hit close to home, and Jake made it a point to encourage him whenever he could. When the mural was finally completed, the town held a small ceremony to unveil it. People gathered in the park, their faces glowing with anticipation. Jake stood in front of the mural, his heart pounding as he prepared to speak. "This mural is more than just paint on a wall," he began. "It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It's proof that no matter how broken we feel, we can find a way to grow, to heal, and to thrive. I couldn't have done this without all of you, without your stories, your support, and your belief in this vision." As the crowd erupted into applause, Jake stepped aside to let them take in the mural. He watched as Marcus, standing with the other volunteers, stared up at the tree he helped bring to life. For the first time since Jake had met him, the boy's face broke into a wide smile. The mural became a local landmark, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and sparking conversations about foster care and community support. Jake's work didn't stop there. He continued to advocate for systemic changes in the foster care system, pushing for better oversight, more resources, and stronger support networks for both children and foster families. He spoke at conferences, met with policymakers, and collaborated with organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. But Jake also knew the importance of small personal connections. He started mentoring kids like Marcus, using art as a tool for healing and self-expression. He held workshops at the community center, teaching children how to draw, paint, and tell their own stories through their work. For many of these kids, it was the first time they felt truly heard. Through it all, Jake stayed grounded, often returning to the park with Max and Mr. Carter. The golden retriever, now older but no less enthusiastic, remained a constant source of comfort and joy. Mr. Carter continued to be a father figure to Jake, offering guidance and wisdom whenever Jake felt overwhelmed. One day, as they sat on a bench near the mural, Jake turned to Mr. Carter. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in that night?" Mr. Carter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I do," he admitted, "and it scares me. But the thing is, Jake, it wasn't just me. It was you. You had the strength to speak up, to accept help. That takes courage." Jake looked at the mural, the vibrant tree standing tall against the sky. "I just want to make sure no one else has to feel the way I did," he said quietly. "You're doing that," Mr. Carter replied. "Every day." Jake's impact continued to grow. His art gained recognition, not just for its beauty, but for the stories it told. He held exhibitions, donated proceeds to foster care programs, and used his platform to amplify the voices of others who had experienced the system. He never forgot where he came from or the people who had helped him along the way. Years later, Jake found himself at another ceremony, this time in his honor. The town had decided to rename the community center after him, recognizing his contributions to the community and his tireless advocacy for children in need. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the faces of friends, neighbors, and children he had mentored, Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's about all of us. It's about the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the belief that we can make a difference. Thank you for believing in me and for helping me believe in myself." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Among them, Jake spotted Marcus, now a teenager, standing tall and proud. The boy had grown into a confident. As the sun set over the park, casting a warm glow on the mural, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had come full circle, but he knew his work was far from over. There were still stories to tell, lives to touch, and a world to change, one act of kindness at a time. After the renaming of the community center in Jake's honor, his influence began to extend beyond the boundaries of his small town. News outlets picked up his story, praising his resilience and the impact he was making in the foster care system. Invitations to speak at events started pouring in, and Jake found himself traveling across the country, sharing his journey and advocating for reforms that could save countless children from the horrors he once endured. Despite the growing recognition, Jake remained deeply connected to his roots. He still visited the mural regularly, touching up sections that had faded and chatting with passersby who stopped to admire it. Marcus often accompanied him, now taking an active role in helping younger kids find their voices through art. The once shy boy had become a leader in his own right, a fact that filled Jake with pride. One day, Jake received a letter in the mail that would change everything. It was from a prominent foundation dedicated to supporting children in foster care. The letter invited Jake to participate in a high-profile roundtable discussion with influential policymakers, child welfare experts, and philanthropists. The goal was ambitious: to create a comprehensive plan to overhaul the foster care system on a national level. Jake hesitated. While he had grown comfortable speaking to crowds and mentoring others, the thought of sitting at a table with such powerful figures intimidated him. He worried his voice wouldn't carry the same weight as those with decades of experience or advanced degrees. But as he reread the letter, he thought about the countless kids still suffering in silence. This wasn't about him. It was about them. When Jake arrived at the roundtable event, held in a grand conference hall in Washington, D.C., he felt a mix of awe and nervousness. The room buzzed with activity, filled with people in suits carrying briefcases and speaking in hurried tones. Jake felt out of place in his simple attire, but as he took a deep breath, he reminded himself why he was there. During the discussion, Jake's nerves quickly faded. As others spoke about policies and statistics, Jake shared his personal story, what it felt like to be a child in the system, the trauma he carried, and the moments of kindness that saved him. His words brought a hush over the room, and when he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. One of the policymakers leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Jake," he said, "your story is a powerful reminder of why we're here. We can argue about policies all day, but it's voices like yours that show us the human side of this issue. What changes would you want to see?" Jake hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. But then he thought of all the kids he had met, the ones who felt invisible, unloved, and hopeless. He spoke with conviction. "We need better training for foster parents," he began. "We need more resources for kids who've been through trauma. And we need a system that listens to the voices of the children it's supposed to protect, because no one knows what they need better than they do." The room erupted in applause. Over the next few hours, Jake worked closely with the group to outline actionable steps, sharing insights from his own experiences and those of the kids he had mentored. By the end of the event, Jake felt a sense of accomplishment, unlike anything he had ever experienced. In the weeks that followed, Jake's involvement in the initiative deepened. He became a key advisor to the foundation, traveling to foster homes, group facilities, and community centers to gather stories and insights from children, foster parents, and social workers. He realized that while his story was unique, the struggles he faced were not. The system was broken in ways that left countless lives hanging in the balance, and Jake was determined to be a catalyst for change. Back in his hometown, Jake began organizing larger-scale projects. One of his most ambitious efforts was the creation of an annual art and storytelling festival for foster children. The event, named Voices Unheard, provided a platform for kids to share their stories through art, music, and performance. It was a celebration of resilience and The first festival was held in the park near the mural, and the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Families, social workers, community leaders, and children from across the state came to participate. Marcus, now a confident young artist, unveiled a stunning sculpture he had created, a phoenix rising from the ashes, symbolizing rebirth and strength. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jake couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for the boy who had once been too afraid to hold a paintbrush. As Jake walked through the festival, he met a young girl named Lily, who was nervously clutching the sketchpad. She couldn't have been more than 7, her eyes wide with uncertainty as she watched the other kids display their work. Jake knelt down to her level and smiled. "What's in the sketchpad?" he asked gently. Lily hesitated before opening it, revealing a series of drawings that told a heartbreaking story of loss, fear, and loneliness. Jake's heart ached as he flipped through the pages. "These are incredible, Lily," he said sincerely. "You have a gift." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "You really think so?" she whispered. "I know so," Jake replied. "And I think the world needs to see what you've created." With Jake's encouragement, Lily agreed to display her drawings. By the end of the day, she was beaming as people stopped to admire her work and tell her how much it moved them. Watching her transformation reminded Jake of his own journey and reinforced his belief in the power of art to heal and empower. The success of the festival caught the attention of national media, further amplifying Jake's message. Donations poured in, allowing him to expand the event to multiple cities and reach even more children. Each festival was unique, filled with stories of hope and resilience, but Jake never lost sight of the individual lives he was impacting. Amid all the progress, Jake faced moments of doubt and exhaustion. The weight of his mission sometimes felt overwhelming, especially as he encountered resistance from those who were skeptical of his ideas or unwilling to change the status quo. But in those moments, he leaned on the support system he had built: Laura and Peter, Mr. Carter and Max, Marcus, and the countless kids whose lives he had touched. They reminded him why he had started this journey and gave him the strength to keep going. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Jake sat alone by the mural, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the painted tree. Max rested his head on Jake's lap, his tail wagging gently. Jake thought about his parents, wondering if they would be proud of the man he had become. "I hope I'm making you proud," he whispered to the wind. "I hope I'm doing enough." In that moment, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. He realized that while he couldn't change the past, he could shape the future, for himself, for the kids he fought for, and for the system he was determined to reform. And that, he knew, was enough. Jake's story continued to evolve, his impact growing with each passing year. He became a symbol of resilience, proof that even the darkest experiences could be transformed into something beautiful. But more than that, he became a voice for the voiceless, a reminder that kindness, courage, and compassion could change the world, one life at a time. Jake's life had become a tapestry of triumphs and challenges, woven together by his unyielding determination to make a difference. Yet even as his efforts gained national attention and his initiatives grew in scope, Jake couldn't ignore the lingering scars of his past. The shadows of his time with Mrs. Linton occasionally crept into his dreams, and moments of doubt threatened to erode his confidence. But each time he felt the weight of those memories, he reminded himself of the countless children who still needed someone to stand up for them. As Jake's art and advocacy continued to expand, he received an unexpected invitation to give a TED talk. The theme of the event was the power of storytelling, and organizers believed Jake's journey was a perfect fit. Though flattered, Jake hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the idea of sharing his story on such a massive platform was daunting. However, after a heartfelt conversation with Mr. Carter, Jake decided to accept the challenge. The day of the event arrived quickly, and Jake found himself standing backstage, his palms sweaty and his heart racing. The audience beyond the curtain was massive, a sea of faces waiting to hear what he had to say. As he took a deep breath, Jake reminded himself of the When the spotlight hit him, Jake stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. He began not with a rehearsed speech, but with the raw truth of his experience. When I was 8 years old, he started, I stood barefoot in the snow, locked out of my foster home, wondering if anyone in the world cared whether I lived or died. That was my reality. But today, I stand here as living proof that even in the darkest moments, hope can take root. His words carried a gravity that silenced the audience. Jake spoke of the kindness of strangers, the power of community, and the resilience that had carried him through unimaginable pain. He shared stories of the children he had met, kids like Marcus and Lily, who had found their voices and begun to heal through art and storytelling. As he concluded, Jake looked out at the audience with a steady gaze. Every one of us has the power to change a life, he said. You don't need to be extraordinary. You just need to care. The standing ovation that followed was overwhelming. Jake felt a surge of emotion as he realized the impact his words had made. After the talk, he was approached by attendees who shared their own stories of overcoming adversity or their newfound commitment to supporting foster children. The experience solidified Jake's belief in the importance of his work and the potential for storytelling to inspire action. In the months that followed, Jake's TED talk went viral, sparking conversations about foster care reform and drawing attention to the systemic issues that had plagued the system for decades. Donations to his initiatives skyrocketed, allowing him to expand his programs even further. He launched a nationwide mentorship network, pairing foster children with artists, writers, and musicians who could help them channel their emotions into creative expression. The program, called Roots to Wings, quickly became one of the most successful projects Jake had ever undertaken. But with success came new challenges. As Jake's responsibilities grew, he found himself struggling to balance his personal life with his work. The relentless pace of meetings, events, and public appearances left him exhausted, and he began to feel the strain of carrying so much on his shoulders. It wasn't until a conversation with Marcus, now a young adult pursuing a degree in social work, that Jake realized he needed to lean on others. "You've taught me so much about asking for help," Marcus said one evening as they worked on a new mural together. "But you've got to take your own advice, Jake. You don't have to do this alone." The words hit Jake like a revelation. He realized he had been so focused on being a source of strength for others that he had neglected his own well-being. With Marcus's encouragement, Jake began delegating more responsibilities to his team and prioritizing time for self-care. He reconnected with Laura and Peter Reynolds, spending quiet evenings at their home and finding solace in their unwavering support. Jake also started seeing a therapist, a step he had long avoided despite advocating for mental health resources for others. The sessions were difficult at first, forcing him to confront the pain he had buried deep inside, but over time, they became a source of healing, helping him process his trauma and rediscover the parts of himself he had lost. As Jake found balance in his life, he began exploring new ways to use his art to drive change. He collaborated with filmmakers to produce a documentary about the foster care system, weaving together his story with those of other foster children and families. The film, titled Unbroken Roots, premiered at a major film festival and was met with critical acclaim. Audiences praised its raw honesty and emotional depth, and the documentary sparked widespread calls for reform. Through it all, Jake remained deeply connected to the children who were the heart of his mission. He continued to mentor kids like Lily, whose confidence as an artist had blossomed since the First Voices Unheard festival. Lily's work was now being featured in galleries, and she often credited Jake for helping her find her path. "You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself," she told him during a festival speech. And that changed everything. Jake's influence began to reach international audiences. He was invited to speak at global conferences, sharing his insights with leaders from around the world. During a trip to Europe, he visited a foster care center in a small town, where he met children whose experiences mirrored his own. Despite language barriers, Jake connected with them through art, creating a mural that symbolized unity and resilience. The experience reminded him that the struggles he had faced were not unique. Back in his hometown, Jake's mural, the tree with deep roots and stretching branches, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Over the years, it had grown to include contributions from people across the community. Each new edition told a story, creating a living tapestry of struggle, survival, and triumph. The mural had become more than a piece of art. It was a testament to the power of community and the enduring strength of the human spirit. One evening, as Jake stood before the mural, he was joined by Mr. Carter, now in his 70s, but still sharp and full of wisdom. Max, though older and slower, wagged his tail as he sat at Jake's feet. "You've come a long way, kid," Mr. Carter said, his voice tinged with pride. Jake smiled, his gaze fixed on the mural. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a chance when no one else did." Mr. Carter placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "All I did was open a door. You walked through it, and you've been opening doors for others ever since." Jake's heart swelled with gratitude. As he looked at the mural, he saw not just his story, but the stories of everyone who had been a part of his journey, the children he had mentored, the people who had supported him, and the community that had rallied around him. In that moment, Jake knew his work was far from finished. There were still lives to touch, systems to change, and stories to tell. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The roots he had planted were strong, and the branches of his efforts stretched far and wide, reaching people he would never meet, but whose lives he would impact nonetheless. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the mural, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had been filled with pain, struggle, and uncertainty, but it had also been defined by resilience, hope, and the extraordinary power of kindness. And as he stood there with Max and Mr. Carter, he knew that the best chapters of his story were still to come. As Jake's journey continued to evolve, so did his vision for the future. The mural, the art festivals, and his advocacy work had created ripples of change, but Jake yearned for something even more transformative, a lasting legacy that could reshape the foster care system from its foundation. He wanted to build something tangible, something that would endure long after he was gone. One sleepless night, an idea took root in his mind. What if there was a place where foster children could find refuge, healing, and hope? Not just a temporary shelter, but a true home, a community where they could feel safe, supported, and empowered to thrive. Jake grabbed a notebook and began sketching his vision. He imagined cottages surrounded by gardens, classrooms filled with art supplies, and mentors dedicated to nurturing the potential of every child who walked through the doors. The idea became an obsession. Jake spent months researching, consulting experts, and rallying support. He pitched his concept, a sanctuary for foster children called Evergreen Village, to philanthropists, community leaders, and government officials. The response was overwhelming. People believed in Jake, not just because of his story, but because of the tangible impact he had already made. Funding for Evergreen Village poured in from across the country, and Jake assembled a team of architects, social workers, and educators to bring his vision to life. The land for the village was donated by a retired couple who had been inspired by Jake's TEE talk. It was a sprawling wooded area on the outskirts of his hometown, with enough space to build a self-sustaining community. Construction began with a groundbreaking ceremony attended by hundreds of supporters. As Jake stood with a shovel in hand, surrounded by children, volunteers, and local leaders, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was more than a project. It was a culmination of everything he had fought for. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jake was deeply involved in every aspect of the village's development, from designing the cottages to selecting the staff. Each decision was guided by his own experiences in the foster care system. He wanted the children who came to Evergreen Village to feel seen and valued in ways he never had during his time with Mrs. Linton. The cottages were designed to be warm and inviting, each with its own unique personality. Some were painted in bright, cheerful colors, while others featured murals created by local artists. The village also included a community center, an outdoor amphitheater, and a library stocked with books and art supplies. When Evergreen Village finally opened its doors, it was a moment of triumph. The first group of children arrived, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Jake greeted each one personally, kneeling down to their level and assuring them that they were safe. Many of the children had experienced unimaginable trauma, and Jake knew the road ahead would be difficult. But he also knew the power of a nurturing environment to spark healing. As the weeks passed, the village came to life. Children who had once been withdrawn and fearful began to open up, forming friendships and exploring their interests. Jake implemented a mentorship program that paired each child with a volunteer from the community. Marcus, now a social worker and a cornerstone of the village's staff, became one of the program's most dedicated mentors. One day, Jake met a boy named Ethan, who had been placed in the foster system after losing his parents in a house fire. Ethan was quiet and guarded, rarely speaking unless spoken to. He spent most of his time drawing in the corner of the library, avoiding the other children. Jake saw himself in Ethan. The same pain, the same fear of trusting others. Jake decided to reach out. He sat beside Ethan one afternoon, pulling out his own sketchbook. "What are you working on?" he asked. Ethan hesitated before showing Jake a drawing of a dragon perched on a mountaintop. The detail was astonishing. The scales shimmered with intricate patterns, and the dragon's eyes seemed to glow with life. "This is incredible," Jake said, genuinely impressed. "You've got a real talent." Ethan shrugged, his eyes downcast. "It's just something I do to pass the time." "Well," Jake replied, "it's something you're really good at. Have you ever thought about creating a story to go with your drawings?" Ethan looked up, intrigued. "A story?" "Yeah," Jake said. "Every dragon needs a story. Where did it come from? What does it want? What's its journey?" Over the next few weeks, Jake worked with Ethan to develop a story for his dragon. The process brought Ethan out of his shell, and soon he was sharing his ideas with other kids in the village. He even started teaching art classes, inspiring younger children to explore their creativity. As Ethan blossomed, Jake saw the transformative power of storytelling in action. It wasn't just about creating art, it was about reclaiming a sense of agency and identity. For kids like Ethan, storytelling was a way to rewrite their narratives, turning pain into purpose. Evergreen Village became a model for foster care reform, drawing attention from around the world. Jake hosted tours for policymakers, educators, and child welfare advocates, sharing the village's successes and encouraging others to replicate its approach. He also launched a scholarship fund for foster children, ensuring they had access to higher education and the resources needed to pursue their dreams. But even as Evergreen Village flourished, Jake remained acutely aware of the work that still needed to be done. The foster care system was vast and deeply flawed, and change was often slow and frustrating. There were days when Jake felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, but he never let those moments deter him. One of the most significant milestones came when Jake was invited to testify before Congress about the state of foster care in America. It was a daunting experience, but Jake knew it was an opportunity to make a real impact. As he spoke about the challenges and successes of Evergreen Village, he emphasized the need for systemic reform. "We can't keep treating foster children as statistics," Jake said, his voice steady and impassioned. "They are individuals with dreams, talents, and potential." Jake's testimony sparked a national conversation, leading to increased funding for foster care programs and the passage of new legislation aimed at improving oversight and support. It was a hard-won victory, but Jake knew it was only the beginning. Through it all, Jake remained deeply connected to the children at Evergreen Village. He celebrated their victories, no matter how small: a perfect test score, a new friendship, a breakthrough in therapy. He mourned their losses, offering a steady presence when the weight of their pasts felt unbearable, and he never stopped reminding them of their worth. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch of one of the cottages, watching the sunset with Ethan and Marcus, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The village was alive with laughter and music, the sounds of children playing and dreaming. It was everything he had hoped for, and more. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" Marcus asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Jake smiled, his eyes on the horizon. "I think about it all the time, but what matters most is how far they'll go." For Jake, the journey was never just about overcoming his own pain. It was about building a future where every child, no matter their circumstances, could find hope, healing, and the chance to thrive. Evergreen Village was the embodiment of that vision, a place where resilience grew strong and dreams took flight. And as Jake looked out over the village he had built, he knew his